I'm going to read just 4 pages, 4.5 pages from this book.
Because I used up all your time.
Yeah. And these are actually the last narrative pages of this book that is coming out next August. I'm so, so happy because some of my students are here. This book is about what they've taught me, what we've learned together about the making of memoir. And I'm choosing this last section because it happens right here in this house, in this home. It is a day much like today. It is my first semester of teaching here. I don't know why I was entrusted with the job, but I'm certainly glad that I have been. It's been a remarkable time. And it's a chapter called Most Unlonely. I walk the campus every day before class, always a new direction, always some memory that I'm stalking. One day I went the length of Locust Walk and out toward West Philadelphia, where a mod-looking bowling alley had been slipped inside a residential street, and the dental school where I once worked had gained the face of new authority. One day behind the medical school I found a garden and a bridged-over pond and sat on its edge recalling my freshman year despair over failed titration labs, the defeating hugeness of biology lecture halls. I've haunted the quad where I once lived, like you. I've studied the facades of fraternity houses. I've stood on the corner of 42nd and Spruce, besieged by memories of the friend with whom I'd shared a passion for Russian history. I remember the room where he kept the books he sometimes stole. I remember the soup he made from his mother's recipe. I remember his fascination with Tolstoy. I remember my betrayal and his. I walk, before I teach memoir, through the places I remember. There was an afternoon during my first year when the air was dark and the sky was rain, and melancholy was my mood, Brillo my temper. I couldn't shake it. This was before I had taken up residency in that Victorian manse. This was the semester that I taught on the second floor of that cozy and intricately stared Kelly Writer's house. I was remembering my mother, who had passed away not long before. I was imagining my son negotiating a university campus all his own. I was missing the book project that I'd set aside so that I might come to Penn and teach. My shoes were soaked through and my umbrella was ineffectual, and the bag I carried across my shoulder was an ache upon my bones. I opened the door to find Jonathan waiting, a magazine on his lap and his long legs folded at liberal angles, like some erector set construction. He was, I thought, taking refuge from the storm. He rose when he saw me, began to climb the stairs beside me, and soon we were joined by another. When we reached the narrow hall just outside our classroom, we found Kim, who had arrived with a days-old kitten tucked into the collar beneath her chin. They call him Wild Bill, she told us, and I think he likes my bling. Do you remember him, Al? For this refugee from the streets of West Philly had dug his claws in deep to her necklace chain and was, it seemed, intent on staying, as most anyone who meets Kim is. We should just talk, Kim said, once we moved into our room, at least to begin with. And because the room was dark and the skies were saturated, because Wild Bill had been whisked to some mysterious zone of safety, because the other students had by now come, we talked about a recent campus suicide, about false diagnoses, about the places where the imagination lives, about reaching beyond the person one already is. We were each in our place, and we were holding on, for this is teaching too, unquantifiable, essential, and life is where memoir begins. We turned finally to Terence Dupre, to his essays, Writing into the World, An Accident and Its Scene, Reflections on the Death of John Gardner. Like so many before me, I am helplessly drawn to this man, his slender, groundbreaking exploration of community and generosity in Nazi death camps, the survivor. The lonely lyric of his essays, his insistence that writers bear witness. Out loud, I read his reflections on John Gardner's ultimately inexplicable early death, with a heart made heavy with the knowledge of Dupre's own far too soon and essentially unreadable passing. I read about the faith Dupre held in this strange and beautiful thing we writers do, quoting from him, "Few of us believe anymore that through art our sins shall be forgiven us, but perhaps it's not too much to think that through art a state of provisional grace can be gained, a kind of redemption renewed daily in the practice of one's craft." I read from Ourselves or Nothing, the poem Carolyn Forche wrote to honor Dupre, and these were our subjects this day: provisional grace, redemption renewed, the endless practice of our craft. How does one speak of grief? I asked my students, to whom does sadness belong? And is knowing what matters most of all, or does wanting to know matter more? Wanting, Kim said softly. Wanting, I agreed. Wanting to know matters more. Those who teach do not create, we're told. Those who give back will not be remembered for their genius. Those who love too much get nowhere. Those who cede the stage are thrust aside. That day the rain kept falling and the skies grew darker, and we kept talking, my students and me, about life and books and secrets and questions, Dupre and Gardner, Fouché and Nazi camps, and Memoir. Long after the quitting hour, we said goodbye, and it was darker and even wetter by the time the train rattled me home. By 10 o'clock that night, I was back at my desk when an email from Jonathan came in, a note and an attachment. And this is Jonathan. This is a brief article about my uncle that my mother forwarded to me this morning, and it seems like a bizarre memoir of sorts. It's definitely not biographical, but more like a semi-connected series of anecdotes, all poorly translated into English. And even if it were translated properly, the tone is so distinctly foreign. At any rate, treat it as a sort of memoir. I thought you might find it interesting. It seems almost like a very narrow window into a life that the author clearly has no understanding of, but is almost unconscious of that ignorance. Well, it was late and I was tired. I opened the attachment and read. I was confused at first, thrust in, as had been promised, to a very foreign world. It wasn't until I reached the essay's end that I found this, quoting from Jonathan's email. During the duration of his teaching, he was noted as the most unlonely teacher. In the eyes of students, he did not look exactly like a teacher. When we mixed around with him, all of us would completely forget his teacher position, and we really had established a true, honest, and deep relationship. Most unlonely teacher. I read the words again, most unlonely. For that is the privilege of teaching memoir, the privilege of reading memoir, the privilege of sometimes writing it, the community that rushes in as we tell the stories that are true. Aren't you tired of memoir yet? I'll be asked from time to time. Don't you want to teach something else? Move on? No, I'll say, I'm not tired yet, because I'm not done and I won't ever be, because memoir will never be fully conquered, because memoir is about life, knowingly, thoughtfully lived. I will be the perpetual student and teacher of memoir until the last fleet of stars in the last night sky performs its light for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Beth. Thanks so much, all three of you. That was really great, wonderful to hear, and it also was a real treat to hear people read the words that I've only read before. I don't know whether there's anything left to say about memoir after that, but I will start by asking a couple of questions, and maybe start with Beth, since you've been writing about this most recently. Memoir is sometimes a form that appears to cover a lot of ground. A lot of things get called memoir. How do you structure a piece, and what separates a memoir from an autobiography or some other forms that it's sometimes confused with, in your view? Yeah.
In my view.
Yeah.
Oh, my students will tell you I have a lot of views about this, but it's really a life knowingly lived and artfully structured. Memoir it's art and actuality combined, and that's a huge clash. That's a very difficult thing to achieve. Autobiography is a life told chronologically over time, without a theme that, in every memoir that I honor, and there are 85 in the back of these, and Cynthia's is one of them, there in the back of this book, there is a certain question or series of questions that has led the writer on the journey toward a whole story. Scene is important, which is dialogue, weather, landscape, color, heart. And it is about art, but it is about, at the same time, not bending life to art.
Sure. Cindy?
I don't think of my work quite as memoir because, and I agree with Beth. There's a difference between autobiography and memoir. The theme is important. For me, because I can barely remember half the things I've done in my life, I have to pick certain moments that resonate to me. And I'm never able to just tell the story of something that happened to me. There has to be a reason why I feel compelled to tell it. So for me, I would really call my version of memoir essay, because an essay to me has both there's an idea and there's an occurrence. And those two things have to come together. And sometimes when I write, I know there's a connection between an idea in my head and something I've experienced or seen. And sometimes it takes me months to prove it. I just have to go on trust. But for me, memoir is taking something you've experienced and opening it up in a way that other people, who haven't experienced the same things, can connect to it because they've asked the same questions. They've had the same emotional concerns.
Well, I'm glad Beth and Cynthia went first because the first time John actually shared some of the questions he might ask us, and I thought, gee, the difference between an autobiography and memoir. Oh, I didn't know there was a difference, but there is, as you're so well saying. I think that what I came up with as I was meditating on it was, I think when I read an autobiography or a biography of another person, I assume that it'll be a straight line. You were talking about kind of choosing what you're going to focus on, and that each part of a person's life will be treated equally, right? A memoir, you don't have to do that. You can focus on certain areas. I spend about 3 pages in this book on my childhood, and in an autobiography, you couldn't do that. And I think there's something about tone. I find I love memoir. I love reading memoirs, and I think the form is a little more conversational and maybe friendly, I guess. Where when I think of autobiography, I think of it as a little daunting. That's kind of my subjective view of things.
Memoirs can end up writing 4, 5, 6 memoirs. Autobiographers typically write one.
Right.
I just want to add something to what Jim said, and that is that I think tone is one of the keys to writing memoir, in that the author's voice is such a crucial part of your experience reading a memoir, because you're not just reading about the facts of their life, you're reading about their emotional life. And one of the reasons you sometimes like one is because you like their tone of voice. You might want to be friends with them. You might relate to the way they see the world. And I think a writer's voice is one of the most important elements of memoir, and what differentiates it from an autobiography.
Well, just on that, that is one of the things that amazes me about certainly about your work is that it is the tone of it, the voice of it is very unique and individual, and just shifts, very, very quickly. And partly that's the comedy of it, is that it seems like it's going in one direction, it shifts off in another. Now, some of the piece that you read this afternoon is a great example of a work that starts out pretty light, pretty domestic comedy kind of thing, and then really shifts at the end to some very, very serious ground. How do you think about that while you're doing it, and how do you manage that sort of shift?
That shift actually it's the hard thing for me is always finding the point I'm trying to make. I can't write the piece unless I know what the point I'm trying to make is. But for the shift, I live on the edge like that. That is me very much. That I am on the edge of panic a lot. And I'm also a comedian, so the two things together, coming back and forth between them, is a fairly natural event for me. And sometimes I manage my fear through comedy, and I like to, why not undercut the comedy with something really dark and horrible. But that part for me is natural. For me, the real work is, what am I trying to say? I don't want to just give the anecdote. The anecdote doesn't mean that much to me. To me personally, but so sometimes what the dark piece, in some pieces, the dark part is the part that gets at what the kernel of the essay is about. because those are the things that we're trying, you use the comedy to cover up the darker parts. And so I think maybe the shift is that.
I think that if we're not writing with fear, whether we're writing with humor or without it, we are not writing memoir. We have to be afraid. We have to not know the answer to the question when we start out. Because if we do, we're simply, we're reporting on a life rather than discovering it as we write it.